The history of the Philippines is a story of migration, cultural fusion, and resilience.
Shaped by centuries of external influences and internal diversity, the Philippines evolved from an
Its past reflects the global currents of trade, religion, and empire that defined Southeast.
Long before European contact, the archipelago that would later be known as the Philippines was home to a complex and dynamic civilization. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that Austronesian-speaking peoples migrated to the islands as early as 3000 BCE, bringing with them advanced knowledge of navigation, agriculture, and metallurgy. These early settlers formed small, kin-based communities known as barangays, typically consisting of 30 to 100 families. Each barangay was led by a dotu, a chieftain whose authority rested on leadership, wealth, and military skill. Pre-colonial Philippine society was highly decentralized. There was no single political entity governing the entire archipelago. Instead, the islands were divided among numerous barangays and regional alliances. Despite this fragmentation, a shared cultural and linguistic heritage linked the various groups. Trade networks connected coastal communities with inland settlements and with neighboring regions such as China, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula. Chinese porcelain, Indian beads, and Arab textiles have been discovered in Philippine archaeological sites, attesting to the archipelago's role in regional commerce. The pre-colonial Filipinos had developed rich traditions of craftsmanship, literature, and spirituality. Metalworking, weaving, and boat building were highly advanced, enabling both local trade and long-distance navigation. Oral epics such as the Hudhud of the Ifugao and the Bayag ni Lamang of the Ilocano people reflected a deep sense of heroism, kinship, and cosmology. Writing systems derived from the ancient Brahmic scripts of South Asia, collectively known as Baybayin, were widely used across the islands. Religion in pre-colonial Philippines was animistic and polytheistic. The people worshipped a variety of deities associated with nature, fertility, and fate. Ancestor worship and ritual offerings were central to community life. The Babylon or Catalonan spiritual leaders, often female, played an important role as healers, priests, and custodians of tradition. While Islam and Hindu-Buddhist influences had reached parts of the archipelago through trade and migration, indigenous beliefs remained dominant until the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. By the early 1400s, Islamic sultanates had begun to emerge in the southern Philippines. The Sultanate of Sulu, established around 1450, and the Sultanate of Maguindanao became powerful centers of trade and governance, connected to the broader Islamic world through Malaysia and Indonesia. Islam introduced new systems of law, education, and literacy, as well as the Arabic script known as Joey. These sultanates would later play a major role in resisting European colonization. When the first Spanish sails appeared on the horizon of the Philippine seas, the islands were already alive with trade, culture, and faith. Independent communities thrived along rivers and coasts, bound not by empire, but by kinship, tradition, and the rhythm of the sea. But in March 1521, everything changed. The expedition of Ferdinand Magellan, sailing under the flag of Spain, landed on the island of Hominhon, off the coast of Samar. It was not just a voyage of discovery, it was a mission of empire, faith, and power. Magellan and his crew were the first Europeans to reach the archipelago. They sought new trade routes, converts to Christianity, and a western passage to the Spice Islands. Magellan met Raja Humabon of Cebu, who, seeing the power of the foreigners, welcomed them and accepted baptism. In that moment, the cross of Spain was raised in the islands, marking the beginning of more than 3 centuries of colonial rule. But not everyone bowed to foreign power. On April 27, 1521, a local leader named Lapu-Lapu from the island of Mecton stood his ground. Refusing to submit to the Spaniards, he and his warriors faced Magellan's men in a fierce battle on the shores of Mecton. Magellan was struck down and killed, a reminder that the islands were not easily conquered. The Spaniards retreated, and for 40 years, the islands remained free of foreign control. But the idea of empire had taken root. In 1565, Spain returned. Under the leadership of Miguel López de Legazpi, the Spanish crown launched a new expedition. This time, not just to explore, but to colonize. Legazpi established Spain's first permanent settlement in Cebu, forging alliances with local rulers and building the first Spanish fortifications. From Cebu, the Spaniards moved northward, capturing Manila in 1571. There, on the shores of Manila Bay, they founded a new city, one that would become the political, religious, and economic heart of the Spanish East Indies. Manila was unlike any city in Asia at the time. Enclosed by stone walls and cannons, it became the center of colonial power, a meeting place of cultures. From here, Spain ruled not only the Philippines, but also extended its influence across the Pacific. For over 250 years, the Philippines became a vital link in Spain's global empire through the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. Each year, massive ships sailed between Manila and Mexico, carrying silver from the Americas and silk, porcelain, and spices from Asia. It was the first true global trade network, connecting 3 continents through the Philippines. Yet, while gold and silver flowed, most Filipinos saw little benefit. Spanish friars and colonial officials grew rich, while the local people endured heavy tribute, forced labor, and land confiscation. Spanish rule transformed every aspect of Filipino life: religion, language, education, and even identity. Missionaries, Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits spread throughout the islands. They built churches, schools, and hospitals, and converted millions to Christianity. In time, the Philippines would become the only predominantly Catholic nation in Asia, but conversion came with control. The friars held immense power, both spiritual and political. They owned vast tracts of land, collected rents, and often acted as local governors. The cross and the crown were one, and those who questioned either faced punishment or silence. Still, the church also brought literacy and learning. The Spaniards established the University of Santo Tomas in 1611, one of the oldest universities in Asia. Many Filipinos learned to read and write, some even in Spanish and Latin, while others preserved their native tongues in secret. Over time, a new society emerged, divided by race, privilege, and birth. At the top were the Peninsulares Spaniards, born in Spain. Below them, the Insulars, Spaniards born in the Philippines. Then the Mestizos, those of mixed ancestry. And at the bottom, the Indios, the native Filipinos. This rigid hierarchy kept the colony obedient, but it also planted the seeds of resentment. For centuries, revolts erupted across the islands, brief, fierce, and often crushed. But by the 19th century, change began to stir. When Spain opened Manila to world trade in 1834, new ideas began to flow with the ship's ideas of freedom, equality, and reform. A new class of educated Filipinos, known as the Ilustrados, emerged. They studied in Europe, where they encountered liberal and nationalist movements. Among them was José Rizal, a doctor, writer, and visionary. Through his novels Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, Rizal exposed the corruption of the clergy and the abuses of colonial power. His words awakened a generation. The Spanish government saw him as a threat. On December 30, 1896, José Rizal was executed by firing squad in Manila. But instead of silencing him, his death ignited a revolution. In that same year, 1896, the secret revolutionary movement, known as the Katipunan, rose in rebellion. Led by Andrés Bonifacio, the Katipuneros fought for independence, carrying the cry of freedom across Luzon and the Visayas. The revolution spread quickly, uniting farmers, workers, and soldiers under a single cause: Chilean freedom. But internal divisions soon weakened the movement. Bonifacio was replaced, and later executed, by Emilio Aguinaldo, who reorganized the revolutionaries in Cavite. By 1898, the winds of global change had reached the Philippines. The Spanish-American War broke out, and Spain found itself facing not only Filipino revolutionaries, but also a new rising power, the United States. After Spain's defeat in the Battle of Manila Bay, Aguinaldo declared the independence of the Philippines on June 12, 1898. Raising the Filipino flag for the first time in Cavite. It was a moment of triumph. 333 years after Magellan's arrival, the Filipino people had reclaimed their right to self-rule, but their freedom would be In December that same year, under the Treaty of Paris, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The revolution's victory turned into a new colonization. The Spanish era had ended, but the struggle for independence had only just begun. For more than 3 centuries, the Philippines had been shaped by Spanish rule. The people had endured oppression, yet they had also absorbed new ideas of faith, education, and identity. Out of colonization emerged a nation, diverse, faithful, and proud. The Spanish period left scars and legacies alike: cathedrals, languages, traditions, and a shared belief that even in the face of empire, the Filipino spirit would never die. When Spain conquered the Philippines in the 16th century, the empire's ambitions reached far beyond its Asian colonies. The Philippines was never rich in silver or gold, nor did it produce the spices that had first driven European exploration. Yet its location was priceless. Situated between China and the Americas, the islands offered a bridge across the world's largest ocean, a crossroads where East and West would finally meet. Iniwu, Miguel López de Legazpi, established Spanish rule in Cebu, and soon afterward, the Manila Acapulco galleon trade began. It would last for more than 250 years, linking Asia, the Americas, and Europe in a single commercial network, the first true system of global trade. Each year, enormous galleons, floating fortresses of wood and canvas, sailed from Manila Bay to the Mexican port of Acapulco. The voyage took 4 months across a vast and dangerous ocean, guided only by stars and the steady winds of the Pacific. From the Americas came silver, mined in the mountains of Mexico and Peru. From Asia came silk, porcelain, spices, ivory, and lacquerware, traded through Chinese, Indian, and Malay merchants. The Philippines became the meeting point, where these treasures changed hands, and where worlds collided. Manila was transformed into the heartbeat of Spain's Pacific Empire. Inside its stone walls, warehouses overflowed with goods from across Asia: fine Chinese silk, Japanese screens, Indian cotton, Indonesian cloves. Outside the walls, native and foreign traders crowded the markets, speaking in dozens of tongues. The city became one of the most cosmopolitan ports in the 17th century, rivaling the great centers of Venice, Goa, and Malacca. The economic system that emerged was simple, yet immense. Silver from the Americas poured into Asia through Manila, paying for the luxury goods that Europeans desired but could not produce. China, in particular, became the principal beneficiary. Spanish silver stabilized the Ming economy, fueling trade across East Asia. In return, Chinese merchants supplied Manila with silk and porcelain, creating an unbroken economic chain stretching from Seville to Beijing. But while this trade enriched the Spanish crown and global merchants, it did little to improve the lives of ordinary Filipinos. The wealth that passed through the islands rarely stayed there. The galleon trade was tightly controlled by Spanish officials and a small group of colonial elites, known as the Conciliado de Comercio, a guild of merchants, who held monopoly privileges. Only 2 galleons per year were allowed to sail, one from Manila to Acapulco and one returning. The system ensured that profits remained concentrated in the hands of a few. To sustain the trade, Filipinos were subjected to heavy tribute and forced labor. The colonial government required towns to provide men for shipbuilding, port work, and coastal defense. Thousands of native carpenters and craftsmen labored in the shipyards of Cavite and Bicol, felling giant trees and constructing vessels that could survive the fury of the Pacific. Many perished from exhaustion or disease. The burden of taxation and forced service weighed heavily on local communities, while the wealth of the galleons passed them by. Still, the galleon trade profoundly reshaped the economy and society of the Philippines. It connected the islands to the global network of exchange, introduced new goods and technologies, and brought cultural influences from around the world. Chinese and Mexican artisans settled in Manila, marrying locals and contributing to the rise of the mestizo class, a mixed community that would later play a crucial role in the country's economic life. Mexican coins circulated in markets, and Mexican foods such as cacao and maize became part of the Filipino diet. Even religious festivals and devotions crossed the Pacific, blending Spanish Catholicism with native and Latin American traditions. Despite its grandeur, the galleon system was both a lifeline and a limitation. For Spain, it secured a steady flow of Asian goods and American silver. For the Philippines, it meant isolation from other markets. The colony was forbidden to trade directly with neighboring Asian nations, except through the official galleon routes. Local industries, such as weaving and pottery, were neglected because colonial policy discouraged competition with Spanish goods. The economy remained dependent, serving imperial needs rather than local development. Over time, cracks began to appear in this vast maritime empire. By the 18th century, European rivals, the Dutch, British, and French, had built stronger, faster fleets. Global demand changed, and Spain's control weakened. Smuggling and corruption became rampant in Manila. The high profits once enjoyed by the Spanish merchants dwindled, and the system began to stagnate. In 1762, during the 7 Years' War, British forces invaded and occupied Manila for 2 years. Although Spain regained the city, the invasion revealed the fragility of its rule. The British encouraged free trade and local enterprise, demonstrating that Manila's economy could thrive beyond the galleon monopoly. When peace returned, the world had already begun to change. The Industrial Revolution in Europe and the opening of new global routes gradually rendered the old system obsolete. By the early 19th century, liberal economists within Spain began to argue for reform. The Royal Company of the Philippines, established in 1785, attempted to modernize trade by promoting agriculture and opening direct commerce with Spain and other Asian ports. But bureaucratic control and vested interests resisted change. Finally, in 1815, the galleon trade came to an end. The last ship, the Magallans, completed its voyage from Acapulco to Manila, closing a chapter that had lasted for 250 years. Its end marked both a loss and a beginning. The monopoly that had long tied the Philippines to the Americas was gone, and the islands were now forced to look toward Asia and Europe for new opportunities. The closing of the galleon trade triggered a wave of transformation. For the first time, Manila was open to direct trade with other countries. British, American, and French merchants began to arrive, bringing new goods and ideas. Local industries, once suppressed, started to grow. Filipino farmers expanded the cultivation of cash crops, such as sugar, abaca, tobacco, and coffee, which became the pillars of the 19th century export economy. The ports of Iloilo, Zamboanga, and Cebu flourished, and a new class of entrepreneurs, many of them Chinese Filipino mestizos, gained wealth and influence. This economic awakening laid the foundation for a new social order. The mestizos, educated in Spanish schools and connected to international trade, began to challenge the dominance of the colonial aristocracy. At the same time, the expansion of global trade exposed Filipinos to liberal and nationalist ideas from abroad. Newspapers and books from Europe circulated among the educated elite. The seeds of reform and revolution that would later bloom in the 19th century were planted in the fertile soil of economic change. The galleon trade had bound the Philippines to Spain for centuries, but its collapse allowed the islands to rediscover their place in Asia and the wider world. The isolation that had once kept the colony dependent slowly gave way to interaction, curiosity, and reform. Yet the legacy of the galleon era endured. The churches and fortresses built to protect the trade routes still stand today. The fusion of Asian, European, and Latin American culture that emerged from those centuries continues to define the Filipino identity, a living testament to the world's first great experiment in globalization. The Manila-Acapulco Galleon Trade remains one of history's most remarkable achievements, a story of courage and endurance, but also of inequality and exploitation. It connected civilizations, created fortunes, and shaped the destiny of a nation. Through storm and silence, across the vast Pacific, it carried not only goods but also ideas, faith, and the unending flow of human history. For the Philippines, it was both a golden age and a gilded cage, a period that transformed the islands into the world's first global crossroads, but at the cost of their freedom to determine their own destiny. And when the sails of the last galleon disappeared beyond the horizon, the Philippines stood on the threshold of a new age, one that would bring reform, revolution, and the dream of independence. When Spain conquered the Philippine Islands, its mission was not only political or economic, it was also spiritual. The Spanish Empire saw itself as the defender of the Catholic faith, chosen by God to spread Christianity across the world. In the Philippines, this mission took form through a process that would reshape the identity of an entire people. The Christianization of the archipelago. From the very beginning of Spanish colonization, religion became the foundation of colonial power. The cross was raised beside the sword. Conversion was not simply a matter of faith, it was a tool of governance, a means to integrate the islands into the global structure of the Spanish Empire. When Ferdinand Magellan first arrived in 1521, he and his priests performed the earliest baptisms in Cebu. Raja Humabon, his wife, and hundreds of followers accepted Christianity, marking the symbolic beginning of the faith in the Philippines. But the true Christianization of the archipelago began decades later, after Miguel López de Legazpi established Spanish rule in 1565. From that moment, the propagation of the faith became inseparable from the establishment of colonial order. The Spanish crown and the Catholic Church worked hand in hand under a system known as the Patronato Real, or royal patronage. Under this agreement, the King of Spain held authority over church appointments and missionary activity in the colonies. The Church, in return, became the empire's moral and spiritual instrument. Through this partnership, religion and government functioned as one. The priest and the governor ruled together, one over the soul, the other over the body. Missionaries arrived from various religious orders: Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, and Recollects. Each order was assigned a specific region or province, where they took charge of converting the local population, building towns, and overseeing daily life. In many areas, friars were the real rulers, wielding more influence than civil officials. They collected taxes, managed estates, and reported directly to the governor-general and the bishop. To convert the Filipinos, the missionaries first had to understand them. They learned local languages, translated prayers and catechisms, and adapted Christian teachings to native traditions. This approach, known as accommodation, allowed the church to blend with local customs rather than destroy them outright. Over time, indigenous beliefs merged with Christian rituals, creating a distinct form of Filipino Catholicism, one rooted in local culture but loyal to Rome. The missionaries built more than churches. They reorganized entire communities. The Spanish introduced the system of reducción, a policy of resettlement that concentrated scattered barangays into centralized towns. Each town was built around a church and a plaza, the physical and symbolic center of both faith and authority. The church bell marked the rhythm of life, calling people to worship, announcing curfews, and even signaling danger. In these new towns, the friar stood as both spiritual leader and community guide. He baptized children, officiated marriages, blessed harvests, and mediated disputes. Through him, religion became a part of everyday life, not confined to Sunday Mass, but woven into the seasons, rituals, and emotions of the people. The spread of Christianity was remarkably successful. Within a century, the majority of the Philippine population had been baptized. Unlike in many other parts of Asia, where Christianity remained confined to small communities, the faith took deep root in the Philippines. Today, more than 4 centuries later, it remains the only predominantly Christian nation in Asia, a legacy of the Spanish missionary enterprise. But conversion came at a cost. Indigenous religions, once rich with spiritual symbolism, gradually disappeared. The Babylon, the priestesses and healers, who had once guided communities, were marginalized and sometimes persecuted as witches or heretics. The myths and rituals that had connected people to nature and their ancestors were replaced by Christian sacraments and saints. Still, Filipino spirituality proved resilient. Rather than vanish, many pre-colonial beliefs survived beneath the surface of Christian worship. The reverence for ancestors transformed into devotion to saints. The rituals for harvest and rain became Christian festivals. The image of the Virgin Mary merged with older symbols of fertility and motherhood. Thus, the Christianity that emerged in the Philippines was not a simple copy of Spanish faith, it was a fusion, a living blend of foreign and native belief. The architecture of the period reflected this transformation. Massive stone churches rose in every province, monuments of faith and power. They were not only places of worship but also fortresses against attack, built to withstand earthquakes, typhoons, and even pirate raids. Their design combined European Baroque style with local materials and craftsmanship. The result was uniquely Filipino, strong, elegant, and enduring. Religion also brought education. The Spanish missionaries established schools to teach reading, writing, and catechism. The first formal educational institutions in the Philippines were run by the church. The University of Santo Tomas, founded by the Dominicans in 1611, and the Colegio de San Ignacio, established by the Jesuits in 1590, became centers of learning for both Spaniards and Filipinos. The church viewed education as a tool for moral formation and social control, but it also opened the door to literacy and intellectual life for many native elites. Through education and evangelization, a new cultural identity began to form. The Spanish introduced European arts, music, and literature. Choral singing, drama, and religious processions became integral to Filipino culture. The local people embraced these forms and made them their own. The Passion, an epic poem recounting the passion and death of Christ, became a central tradition during Holy Week, blending the cadence of native oral poetry with Catholic theology. The influence of the church extended beyond the spiritual and cultural realm into economics and politics. Religious orders became major landowners, controlling vast estates, known as friar lands. These lands provided wealth to sustain the missions, but they also deepened inequality and resentment. The friars' dominance over rural life meant that peasants remained dependent on the church for their livelihood. This concentration of power, while maintaining order, would later become one of the sparks of revolution. By the 19th century, the abuses of the friars and the exclusion of native priests from high positions led to the secularization controversy, a movement that demanded equality within the church. Filipino priests, such as Padre Jose Burgos, Padre Mariano Gomez, and Padre Jacinto Zamora, known collectively as Gamberza, became symbols of this struggle. Their execution in 1872 inspired future nationalists, including Jose Rizal, to fight for both religious and political freedom. Despite these tensions, Christianity remained a unifying force. It gave the scattered islands a common language of faith and morality. Festivals like the Saturnino of Cebu, the Black Nazarene of Quiapo, and the Our Lady of Penafrancia in Bicol became expressions of shared identity. These devotions crossed social boundaries, uniting peasants and elites, towns and provinces, in collective celebration. The Christianization of the Philippines was thus both a spiritual and cultural revolution. It replaced the old gods with new symbols, but carried forward the same longing for connection, community, and transcendence. It provided moral order under colonial rule. Yet it also nurtured the seeds of resistance by awakening a sense of dignity and destiny among the people. Through the church, the Filipino learned not only obedience but also conscience. From the pulpit and the classroom came lessons about virtue, justice, and sacrifice, lessons that later generations would turn against the colonial system itself. The same faith that legitimized Spanish rule would one day inspire its overthrow. The legacy of Christianization endures in every aspect of Filipino life, in language, art, and ritual. Spanish words fill the daily vocabulary. Catholic festivals mark the calendar. Churches dominate town plazas. But beneath these European forms lies a distinctly Filipino soul, vibrant, emotional, and enduring. The Philippines became one of Spain's most loyal and spiritual colonies, a land where devotion was deep and visible. Yet, as history would reveal, faith could not forever mask the human desire for equality and freedom. The gospel that came with the conquistadors carried within it the message of liberation, that all men are equal before God. And when the time came, that message would ignite the conscience of a people ready to rise, not against faith, but in its name, to claim their rightful place in the history of nations. When Spain established its rule in the Philippines, it did not merely conquer territories, it built a new political and social order that would define the colony for more than 3 centuries. This structure combined European governance with local customs, Catholic doctrine, and imperial control. It was both complex and rigid, designed to ensure stability, obedience, and the flow of wealth from the islands to the Spanish crown. At the very top of this colonial hierarchy stood the King of Spain, considered both ruler and protector of the colony. From across the oceans, the monarch held supreme authority over the Philippines, though in practice, power was delegated to his representatives. The most powerful of these was the Governor-General, who acted as the king's viceroy and the head of the entire colonial government in Manila. The Governor-General possessed near absolute authority. He was the chief executive, commander of the military, and president of the Royal Audiencia, the highest court of justice. He could appoint or remove officials, oversee finances, and implement royal decrees. In many ways, he was both governor and king within the islands, a symbol of imperial presence in Asia. Yet with such immense power came corruption and abuse. Many governors enriched themselves through trade monopolies and favoritism, blurring the line between public duty and personal gain. Beneath the Governor-General stood the Royal Audiencia, established in 1583 as the highest judicial body in the colony. It served as both court and advisory council, ensuring that the colony followed Spanish law. The Audiencia was composed of judges known as oidores, and although it was meant to balance the governor's authority, its members were often appointed from the same elite circles, making true checks on power rare. At the provincial level, the Philippines was divided into provinces, or alcaldias, and corregimientos. Each province was governed by either an alcalde mayor or a corregidor, who represented the Spanish crown. These officials combined administrative, judicial, and fiscal powers, acting as both magistrates and tax collectors. However, due to the vast distances and lack of infrastructure, communication with Manila was slow. Many provincial governors operated with considerable autonomy, and reports of corruption, extortion, and abuse were frequent. Below them were the municipalities or pueblos, the heart of daily life for most Filipinos. Each town was governed by a local official called the Gobernador Chilo, literally little governor. The Gobernador Chilo was usually a member of the native elite, known as the Principalia, elected annually by fellow principals but confirmed by the Spanish authorities. He was responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and enforcing colonial decrees. He presided over local disputes and served as intermediary between the Spanish government and the Filipino people. Assisting him were the cabezas de barangay, descendants of pre-colonial village chiefs, who now served as the lowest level of administration. Each cabeza supervised a group of about 50 families, collecting tribute and reporting to the gobernador Chilo. This structure effectively incorporated the old barangay system into the colonial order, transforming indigenous leadership into instruments of Spanish rule. The Spanish also relied heavily on the Catholic Church to maintain political stability. The friars not only administered parishes, but also influenced civil governance. In many towns, the parish priest overshadowed the gobernador Chilo in authority. The priest's power extended to education, moral discipline, and even economic management. In the absence of strong civil institutions, the clergy became the real governors of the people, uniting religion and politics into one system of control. Through this combination of administrative hierarchy and religious authority, Spain maintained effective rule over thousands of islands with minimal military presence. The colony's structure relied less on force and more on social hierarchy, a pyramid of power that ensured loyalty at every level. At the top of the social hierarchy stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. They occupied the highest offices in both church and government. To be a peninsular was to belong to the ruling class, privileged by birth, language, and education. Below them were the insulars, also called criollos, Spaniards born in the Philippines. Though they shared the same blood as the peninsulares, they were often excluded from top positions and looked down upon as provincial. This rivalry between peninsulares and insulars created tension within the colonial elite, foreshadowing divisions that would later shape Philippine nationalism. Next in the hierarchy were the mestizos, people of mixed ancestry. Among them were the mestizo de sangre, or Chinese Filipino mestizos, who became a powerful economic class. Many were descendants of Chinese traders who had intermarried with local women. Over time, they became merchants, landowners, and professionals. Their economic success allowed them to gain influence, though social prejudice still limited their access to power. Beneath them were the Indios, the native Filipinos, who made up the vast majority of the population. They were farmers, laborers, fishermen, and artisans, the backbone of the colonial economy. Though officially recognized as subjects of the Spanish king, their lives were shaped by tribute, forced labor, and the authority of local officials. Most Indios lived under the supervision of friars, whose approval was necessary for nearly every aspect of life: marriage, education, and even burial. At the margins of society were the Sanglese ethnic Chinese immigrants, who continued to arrive throughout the Spanish period. The Spaniards viewed them with suspicion, but also depended on their skills in trade and craftsmanship. Periodically, Chinese communities faced persecution and massacres, especially during times of unrest, yet their economic role remained indispensable. The Sanglese supplied the colony with goods, built its cities, and helped sustain the galleon trade. This stratified order ensured stability, but also sowed the seeds of inequality and resentment. Power and privilege were distributed according to race and birth, not merit. The native population was taught obedience, but also patience and endurance, virtues that would later transform into strength and defiance. Education under the Spanish further reinforced the hierarchy. The church controlled most schools, focusing on religious instruction and basic literacy. Only the sons of the elite, especially mestizos and principals, could access higher education in seminaries and universities. Spanish was the language of authority, law, and religion, while most Filipinos continued to speak their native tongues. The linguistic barrier reinforced social distance, reminding the people daily of who ruled and who obeyed. Economically, the social order was mirrored by land ownership. Large estates, or haciendas, were controlled by religious orders and elite families. Peasants worked the land as tenants, giving a portion of their harvest as rent. The friar estates became symbols of both prosperity and oppression, centers of agricultural productivity that sustained the colony, yet also the source of deep rural poverty. Over the centuries, this structure produced a society that was stable but stagnant. Loyalty to authority was prized over innovation. The colonial government discouraged political participation and suppressed dissent. Filipinos were not citizens but subjects, valued for their labor, not their voice. However, within this rigid hierarchy, a slow transformation was taking place. The mestizos and principals began to acquire education and wealth. Through commerce, they gained exposure to the wider world. They learned to read, to write, and to question. By the 19th century, this educated class, the ilustrados, would challenge the colonial order itself. The same system that had kept the Philippines submissive for centuries would eventually give birth to its own undoing. The gobernadorcillo's office trained Filipinos in leadership. The church's schools taught them to think. The injustices of racial hierarchy awakened in them a desire for equality. And as global ideas of liberty and nationhood spread from Europe to Asia, the Filipino people would begin to imagine a different kind of hierarchy, one not based on birth, but on freedom. The political structure and social order of Spanish rule thus achieved what the empire had intended: control, cohesion, and faith. But it also created what it feared most: consciousness. The same laws that enforced obedience also taught organization. The same schools that preached submission also sparked awareness. By the late 19th century, the colonial pyramid that had once seemed immovable began to crack. The indio had become the ilustrado, the subject had become the thinker, and the governed had begun to dream of governing themselves. The structure of Spanish power would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The hierarchy that divided the people would be challenged by the idea of equality. Out of centuries of silence, a voice was rising, a voice that would soon call, not for reform, but for revolution. When Spain took possession of the Philippines, it did not only conquer its lands, it sought to shape the minds and souls of its people. Through education, language, and religion, the Spanish colonial regime aimed to transform a collection of diverse islands into a unified colony bound by faith, loyalty, and obedience. But while Spain's schools were meant to strengthen imperial control, they ultimately gave rise to a new generation of Filipinos educated, awakened, and ready to define their own identity. From the beginning, the Spanish understood the power of education. The missionaries who arrived with the conquistadors believed that true conversion required more than baptism. It required instruction. To spread Christianity, the friars taught catechism, reading, and writing to the native population. Schools were established beside churches in nearly every town. These were escuelas parroquiales, or parish schools, run by priests and friars. In these schools, education was simple but disciplined. Children learned prayers, Christian doctrine, basic arithmetic, and moral conduct. The goal was not intellectual freedom, but religious obedience. Education was designed to produce loyal subjects and devout Catholics, not independent thinkers. Yet even this limited education planted the seeds of literacy and curiosity among the people. The first teachers were the friars themselves. They learned local languages and used them to translate prayers, catechisms, and instructional materials. By teaching in the vernacular, the missionaries reached more converts and made Christianity accessible to the masses. Ironically, this also helped preserve native languages and traditions. While the Spanish authorities later promoted Spanish as the official language, most Filipinos remained fluent in their own tongues. The Philippines became a multilingual colony, united by faith but divided by language. In time, more formal institutions of learning appeared. The Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, and Recollects founded schools, colleges, and universities across the islands. These institutions offered higher learning to the sons of the elite, especially those of Spanish, Mestizo, or Principalia descent. The earliest of these was the Colegio de San Ignacio, founded by the Jesuits in 1590, followed by the University of Santo Tomas in 1611, the oldest university in Asia still in existence today. These schools taught Latin, philosophy, theology, and the humanities. The curriculum was modeled after that of European universities, emphasizing Catholic doctrine and classical education. Though limited to a privileged few, these institutions produced a small educated class that would later shape the country's future. For the most part, education remained under the control of the church. The friars decided who could study and what could be taught. Science, history, and liberal arts were often secondary to religious training. Women's education was minimal and focused on domestic skills and Christian values. Yet even within these constraints, knowledge slowly spread beyond the walls of monasteries and convents. By the 18th and 19th centuries, secular reforms began to reach the colony. The Spanish crown, influenced by the Enlightenment, recognized that education could serve both faith and progress. In 1863, Queen Isabella II of Spain issued the Educational Decree of 1863, a landmark law that established the first public education system in the Philippines. For the first time, primary education became compulsory for both boys and girls. Municipal schools were to be built in every town, funded by local governments and supervised by the colonial administration. Although implementation was uneven, the decree marked a turning point. The Philippines became one of the first countries in Asia to have a formal public school system. Filipino children, regardless of class, had the opportunity to receive basic education. The decree also introduced teacher training schools, ensuring that qualified instructors, both male and female, could educate future generations. Still, the Spanish language remained the gateway to higher learning and official life. Mastery of Spanish became a symbol of prestige and power. It separated the educated elite from the masses, creating a linguistic divide that mirrored the social hierarchy. For many Filipinos, Spanish was not just a language, but a key to influence, a way to communicate with the colonial authorities and to participate in public affairs. But while the Spanish language elevated a few, it excluded many. Most Filipinos continued to speak their native dialects: Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, Kapampangan, and others. These languages remained the voice of the people, carrying oral traditions, songs, and folk wisdom. The coexistence of Spanish and native tongues gave birth to a uniquely Filipino identity, both colonial and indigenous, foreign and native. This complex identity was reflected in the rise of a new social class, the ilustrados, or enlightened ones. Educated in Spanish schools and often sent to study in Europe, the ilustrados became the intellectual leaders of the late 19th century. They mastered the language and ideas of the colonizer, but used them to challenge the very foundations of colonial rule. Among them was José Rizal, whose education exemplified the transformative power of learning. Trained in Manila and later in Madrid, Rizal absorbed both Spanish culture and European liberal thought. Through his writings, particularly No Limay Tandri and El Filibusterismo, he exposed the hypocrisy and abuses of the colonial system. His works were written in elegant Spanish, the language of power, but his message spoke for the oppressed. In his hands, the colonizer's language became a weapon of liberation. Education had given the Filipinos new tools to understand their condition. The more they learned, the more they questioned. Exposure to Western ideas of liberty, equality, and human rights awakened a consciousness that could no longer be silenced. The same schools that trained obedient subjects had unintentionally created reformers, revolutionaries, and patriots. Meanwhile, education for women also began to expand. The Beaterio schools, run by nuns, offered instruction in reading, writing, embroidery, and religion. In 1863, the same decree that established public schools for boys extended education to girls. Slowly, Filipino women began to take part in the intellectual and cultural life of the colony. Figures like Leona Florentino, often regarded as the first Filipino poetess, proved that intellect and artistry transcended gender. Language, too, evolved. Spanish words entered native vocabularies, blending with Tagalog and other dialects. Everyday life became a mixture of cultures: Catholic prayers in local tongues, Spanish phrases in folk songs, and native idioms in colonial sermons. This hybrid language reflected the Filipino experience, neither wholly indigenous nor wholly European, but something new and dynamic. By the late 19th century, literacy rates in the Philippines were among the highest in Asia. Thousands could read and write, even if they had never set foot in Spain. Newspapers, pamphlets, and novels circulated widely, carrying ideas that transcended colonial boundaries. Publications, such as La Solidaridad, founded by Filipino expatriates in Europe, became platforms for reform and nationalism. Through education and language, a new kind of Filipino identity was born, one that combined faith with reason, tradition with modernity, and submission with resistance. The schools that had once taught loyalty to Spain now produced citizens who dreamed of a nation free from it. This awakening was not immediate, but inevitable. The Filipinos who learned to read the Bible also learned to read history. Those who mastered the Spanish language discovered the power of speech and writing. And those who entered the church's schools learned not only to obey but also to think, to question, and eventually to lead. In the end, the Spanish educational system achieved something it had never intended: the creation of a literate, conscious, and politically aware people. The very instruments of colonial control became the channels of liberation. Knowledge, once confined to monasteries and cathedrals, flowed into towns and villages, shaping minds and stirring hearts. Education, language, and faith had bound the Philippines to Spain. But they also gave the Filipinos the strength to imagine themselves apart from it. In classrooms and churches, in letters and poems, a new nation was quietly forming, one that would soon demand not only reform, but freedom. The story of education during the Spanish period is therefore not a tale of submission, but of transformation. The school became the battlefield of ideas. The language became a bridge between rulers and the ruled, and identity became the weapon of the oppressed. Out of the colonial classroom emerged the soul of a nation, educated, enlightened, and unbreakable. For more than 3 centuries, the Filipino people lived under Spanish rule, a rule that brought faith, structure, and learning, but also inequality, forced labor, and silence. Beneath the surface of this colonial peace, however, grew a quiet discontent. It began as whispers in the towns, murmurs in the markets, and songs in the fields, until, at last, it would become a voice strong enough to shake an empire. From the earliest years of colonization, Filipinos resisted foreign domination. Across the islands, revolts erupted again and again. Some were sparked by excessive tribute and forced labor, others by the loss of ancestral lands or religious oppression. Though these uprisings often failed, they revealed a deep and enduring desire for freedom, a spirit that no decree could extinguish. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these revolts were local and fragmented. The people of Pampanga rose against forced labor, the Ilocanos protested abusive officials, and in the Visayas, peasants rebelled against tribute collectors. Each revolt burned fiercely, but briefly. Without a sense of national unity, the people fought for their own provinces, their own causes, unaware that their struggle was shared across the islands. The Spanish called these uprisings motins, disturbances, but they were more than that. They were early expressions of dignity, the first sparks of what would later become a revolution. By the 19th century, the world around the Philippines was changing. New ideas from Europe, liberty, equality, and democracy began to spread across oceans and colonies. The French Revolution had challenged kings. The American Revolution had defied empire. These events awakened minds everywhere, including in the distant islands of the Pacific. The Philippines, long isolated by the galleon trade, began to open to the world. In 1834, Spain decreed that Manila would be open to international commerce. With that single act, the Philippines entered the modern global economy. British, American, and French traders arrived, bringing not only goods, but also new ideas. Filipino merchants, educated men, and mestizos began to travel abroad, seeing for the first time what life could be beyond colonial rule. The opening of trade also brought wealth to a new class, the ilustrados, or enlightened ones. These were the educated Filipinos, many of whom were mestizos, or members of the Principalados. They were fluent in Spanish, schooled in European philosophy, and inspired by liberal thought. They read books from France and Spain, studied in foreign universities, and began to question the foundations of colonial power. One of the early voices of reform came from within the church itself. Filipino priests, long excluded from high positions, began to demand equality with their Spanish counterparts. This movement, known as the secularization movement, argued that native clergy should have the right to lead their own parishes. The movement was led by 3 courageous priests, José Burgos, Mariano Gomez, and Jacinto Zamora, known to history as In 1872, a mutiny by Filipino soldiers and workers in Cavite gave the Spanish authorities an excuse to suppress the movement. Though Gambaza had no role in the mutiny, they were accused of sedition and executed publicly in Manila. Their deaths sent shockwaves across the archipelago. For many, it marked the end of hope for reform within the church, but also the birth of a deeper, more defiant nationalism. Among those deeply moved by the execution of Gambaza was a young student named José Rizal. Their sacrifice would inspire him and his generation to dedicate their lives to the cause of freedom, not through violence, but through knowledge and enlightenment. By the late 19th century, a new intellectual movement had emerged. Known as the propaganda movement, it was led by Filipino reformists who sought change through education, literature, and peaceful advocacy. Many of them lived in Europe, where they could speak freely and publish their works. They founded newspapers, associations, and clubs to express their ideas and demand reforms from Spain. Foremost among them was José Rizal, joined by Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano López Llena, and others. They wrote passionately about injustice, racism, and the need for reform. Their newspaper, La Solidaridad, became the voice of the Filipino, and through its pages, they called for representation in the Spanish Cortes, equal rights for Filipinos, secularization of the clergy, and freedom of the press and assembly. Rizal's novels, No la mi tangeri tuchme not, and El filibusterismo terrain of greed, revealed the hypocrisy and corruption of colonial society. He wrote not as a rebel, but as a reformer, appealing to reason and humanity. Yet his words carried more power than any weapon. The characters he created, the innocent Ibarra, the suffering Sisa, and the revolutionary Simoon, became symbols of the Filipino condition. His books were banned in the Philippines, but they circulated in secret, igniting hearts and minds. While the propaganda movement was peaceful, it awakened something far more profound: national consciousness. For the first time, Filipinos began to see themselves, not as Tagalogs, Ilocanos, or Visayans, but as members of one nation, sharing one destiny. The idea of Filipino evolved from a colonial label to a source of pride. The pen of Rizal had done what centuries of rule could not: unite the people in thought. Yet Spain remained deaf to reform. The colonial authorities dismissed the propagandists as dreamers and traitors. The gap between promise and reality grew wider. The more Filipinos learned, the more they recognized their subjugation. Education had created a generation too wise to be silent, too proud to be slaves. Among the youth, a new spirit took hold, not just of reform, but of revolution. In Ibaguar, José Rizal returned to Manila and founded La Liga Filipina, a civic organization that sought peaceful reform and mutual aid among Filipinos. But the Spanish authorities, alarmed by his growing influence, arrested him and exiled him to Dapitan in Mindanao. His exile silenced reform, but it also fueled anger. Out of the ashes of La Liga Filipina rose a new and more radical organization, the Kati, founded by Andres Bonifacio, Emilio Jacinto, and Ladislao Diwa. The Katipunan was a secret revolutionary society dedicated to total independence. Its members took an oath of blood, vowing to fight until the Philippines was free. They called each other captured brothers, and swore loyalty not to Spain, but to their motherland. The Katipunan spread rapidly across Luzon and the Visayas. Its motto, Katastasan Kagalangalong, Katipunan, NGMG, Emogak, NG Bayon, embodied both reverence and rebellion. Unlike the propagandists, the Katipuneros believed that freedom could no longer be begged for, it had to be taken by force. By 1896, the movement had grown too large to hide. When Spanish authorities discovered its existence, the Katipuneros decided to act. On August 23, 1896, Bonifacio and his men gathered in Caloocan. There, they tore their sedulous residence certificates and shouted, Mabuhay ang Kalayan, Engi Pilipinas. It was the cry of Pujad Lawin, the declaration of revolution. The Philippine Revolution had begun. Though the uprising faced great challenges, poor weapons, limited organization, and harsh reprisals, it spread like wildfire. Town after town rose in rebellion. The revolution united the rich and poor, the educated and the unlettered, in a common cause. For the first time, the Filipino nation had taken up arms against empire. But the revolution was not without conflict. Differences in leadership led to tension between Bonifacio and a young general named Emilio Aguinaldo. Eventually, Aguinaldo's faction gained control, and Bonifacio was executed. Despite this tragedy, the struggle continued. In 1897, the Pact of Biak-na-Bato temporarily ended hostilities. Aguinaldo went into exile in Hong Kong, while Spain promised reforms that would never come. But destiny had other plans. A year later, in 1898, the Spanish-American War erupted. The conflict between two empires gave the Filipino Revolution a new opportunity and a new challenge. In May 1898, the American fleet defeated Spain in the Battle of Manila Bay. Aguinaldo returned from exile and proclaimed Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, in Coet, Cavite. The flag of a free Philippines was raised for the first time, and the anthem of liberty was sung. After more than 300 years of colonial rule, the Filipino dream of freedom had finally become a reality, at least for a moment. The movement that began with pens ended with swords. The reforms that Spain refused to grant had turned into a revolution it could no longer control. And though the story of independence was not yet complete, the awakening of a nation was irreversible. The period of resistance and reform in the 19th century marked the birth of the Filipino nation. From education came awareness. From awareness, unity, and from unity, the courage to fight for freedom. The Spaniards had once sought to educate the Filipino to make him obedient. Instead, they taught him to think. They built schools to create loyal subjects, and created patriots instead. They introduced a language meant to divide, and it became the language of rebellion. The flames that consumed an empire were lit not by hatred, but by hope. The hope of a people who had learned that they were one, and that they were capable of destiny. Out of centuries of silence rose a single word, K-A-L-A-Y-A-A-N, freedom, and once spoken, it could never again be unspoken.